The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anuj Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping shape it. Welcome back. Hope you're all well. I am currently in Australia on a family holiday, so this is just a quick one from me. As ever, the show is sponsored by my lovely friends at Lumino. Today we are talking about cannabis regulation. Lumino place full-time regulatory and compliance managers across Europe, as well as providing consultants where necessary. They also deal with plant-facing and commercial roles too. So, as always, if you need help with HR or recruitment, please do get in touch with them at luminorecruit.com, and please do mention my name when you do. Now, on with the show. Enjoy. On today's show, I have Robert Jappie. Robert is a partner at Fieldfisher, which is a law firm, and he specialises in life sciences regulation. He's very well known to most people in the UK in this industry. So, welcome, Rob. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, Anuj. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, good to finally get you on, man. It's been a long time we've been trying to do this, so it's good.
I've been waiting. I feel like I've finally arrived.
Wow.
You know, it's a big deal to be invited on your podcast, so thank you.
Oh, no, appreciate your time, man. Appreciate your time. And it's good you have got, such great experience in the space, and you know so many people in the UK and in Europe as well. So there's loads of stuff to talk around. But let's get a bit of info about you to begin with, where we usually start, a bit of your personal backstory and how you got into this space.
Yeah, sure. So I was a criminal defence lawyer for about 12 years before I decided to focus on the cannabis sector. I started out as a legal aid hack, shuffling from police station to prison to court, lots of blood and guts and sex and violence. It was a great job as a young man. I really enjoyed it. But, there's only so far you can progress in that world. So I decided I wanted to do fraud and financial crime. So I left the practice and went and studied a master's degree in financial regulation and compliance, which was as dry as it sounds. But I studied it part-time, and I was lucky enough to work in the legal team for a charity called Release. And Release is a drugs and human rights charity. They campaign for the decriminalisation of drug possession. They think drug use should be a public health issue rather than a criminal justice issue. And I was in their legal team for a couple of years, and I was doing sort of lots of policy work and lobbying work. And it was fascinating because at that time, it probably would have been about 2015, there was legalization rolling out across the states, state by state, medical first and then recreational. And it just dawned on me that when cannabis comes to Europe, it's going to be huge. It seemed inevitable. It was just a question of when. So when I finished my master's degree, I went back into private practice, focusing on sort of high-level fraud and financial crime. But this idea of focusing on cannabis regulation just wouldn't stop nagging at me. So the kicker, the thing that gave me the motivation to do it, there was an article in the Lawyers Gazette, the magazine that the lawyers get, and it was about Hoban Law Group in the US. There was an interview with Bob Hoban, and at the end of the article, it started to talk about new offices and new jurisdictions that he was focusing on, and London was one of them. And I just thought, I need to do this before someone else comes and does it, and I hate myself. So that was the motivation to just do a complete pivot and focus on cannabis regulation.
That's pretty brave, though. It's not like it's not a controversial topic. Did you get any blowback from your family, friends, or colleagues, or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, look, the firm I was at when I started this, it's only a small firm, but credit to them, they really created an environment that encouraged innovation. So, if you had ideas about how to generate work, then they'd give you the support and the platform to do it. So early 2018, we did our due diligence on the sector. We saw there was a small CBD industry at that time in the UK, but it was growing quickly. We joined the only trade association that was around at the time, and the work just started rolling in. All of these businesses who'd been trying to navigate this complex legal environment with very little assistance, with very little guidance, suddenly, they had someone to speak to about and someone to ask for help with all the issues that they were dealing with. And it just completely snowballed. My timing was really good. So November 2018, the UK government suddenly legalised medical cannabis, much to everyone's surprise. And so from the end of 2018, that was pretty much all I was doing, was advising CBD and medical cannabis companies on all the day-to-day issues that they face. From a sort of, well, look, one story is my current wife. We were on our third date and she saw a book on cannabis regulation in my bag. And she said, "What's that?" And I said, "Oh, I'm going to start a cannabis regulatory department." She said, "That's the stupidest idea I've ever heard." She said, "It's never going to be legalized and you're completely wasting your time." And now look, so yeah, the whole time we've known each other, it's the only time she's ever been wrong. So there we are. But yeah, look, my mother as well, she was very much like, "I didn't send you to, all those schools and that university for so many years so that you could help people sell weed." But they've all come around to the idea now. They see the value in it, and it's nice to be doing something that is interesting and exciting, but also helping people as well.
Absolutely. And it's good that you're doing it. And you've been of great help to many companies in the space. So that is good. And just before we're going to talk about the subject of cannabis and what you actually do, the regulation side of it. So we'll get into the detail on that in a minute. But do you also cover psychedelics? Are you seeing much work in that space as well?
It's limited at the moment. The regulatory environment for psychedelics here in the UK is very restrictive, not dissimilar to cannabis. We are a long way behind where they are in North America, but there is a lot of interest in it. You know the guys at Clerkenwell very well. They're doing great things, and it's fantastic that we actually have clinical trials now ongoing in the UK where patients are actually receiving psychedelic medication. So that's great. It's an expensive process to be involved in. So I know there are lots of companies who are trying to raise money in order to engage in those trials via Clerkenwell, but it's limited. So I think there's still a lot of lobbying efforts going on to have some rescheduling involved. The work I get is mainly regulatory inquiries from North America, just saying, what's the regulatory environment in the UK or the EU? What can we do? Where can we do it? And unfortunately, there isn't an awful lot that I can say to them in terms of being able to commercialize that business right now. But it is inevitable that it will grow and grow and grow. So it's definitely an area that I'm keeping a close eye on.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a disconnect between the excitement and what the reality is in terms of an industry, let's say, because of what's allowed.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been very fortunate to be able to build a practice on cannabis work. We are very, very far away, I think, from a lawyer being able to do that just in relation to psychedelics.
Yeah, I agree. Great. And just, before we get on to the main topic, what are the types of clients you're working with across the sector? Because obviously it's quite big. Do you work with industrial hemp clients as well as medical and CBD?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's the full range of businesses that are involved in all aspects of the supply chain, whether it's medical cannabis or consumer CBD. There has obviously been a number of companies that have been able to cultivate hemp in the UK for a while. It's still very restrictive, as you know. They can't use the bud and the flower and the leaves of the plant, which is incredibly frustrating. But you have excellent companies making good use of what they can do, particularly in the sort of carbon sequestration areas and the hemp construction materials and textiles and that sort of thing. So the companies I act for are at all stages of the supply chain, and they all have extensive regulatory issues and compliance issues that I'm sure you can imagine.
Yes, you're a busy boy. That's good.
Yeah, it's interesting just because, 2021 was obviously a very, very busy year for the cannabis sector. 2022 was the complete opposite. And I'm fortunate from a regulatory perspective, there were still lots of issues going on to keep me busy, novel foods and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, definitely the deal activity dried up pretty much in 2022. We're just starting to see things open up in that respect this year. And I think 2024 is going to be big. But, although the regulatory and compliance bit is very, very important, we all want to see the deals. We all want to be involved in the deals. Those are the most exciting and lucrative areas to be involved in as a lawyer.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Well, thank you. So getting into the main topic, which is kind of an update on regulation of cannabis in the UK, and that's across the whole spectrum, medical, hemp, CBD. What is happening at the moment in the UK? And you don't have to go too basic because, let's assume a level of knowledge on the audience's behalf, but what are the kind of main bits and pieces that are happening and where are you seeing the changes that are needed?
So on the medical cannabis side of things, I've reached a conclusion. We're at a real exciting inflection point for the industry. We have patient numbers have grown very slowly over the last 4 years for a range of reasons. There's probably 5, 6, 7 big reasons that can be identified as to why medical cannabis has progressed so slowly. What I feel is that companies are now starting to really understand those problems and address them. And if you can solve 4 or 5 of those issues, then you can really, really move things forward. And I think we're getting to that point now. Supply chain issues are being resolved. Customer service issues are being resolved. Medical cannabis companies are being more aggressive in their marketing and their advertising, which is fantastic. And as a result, I just feel we're going to see a real big increase in patient numbers in the next few years, which is really, really exciting. There's been some international events which have assisted the UK sector, I think. I think Germany having to substantially row back on their legalization plans and meant that sort of internationally the focus has returned to the UK as a big growth market for medical cannabis. There's still a lot of work to do, and it's been a very, very hard 4 years for the early movers. It doesn't seem to have deterred new entrants into the market, and I think people are really starting to see an opportunity now here in the UK. Hopefully that will be borne out by patient numbers, because what are we at, 20, 30,000? It's far too low for a country where apparently there's as many as 1.8 million people self-medicating with cannabis from the illicit market. So medical cannabis is very exciting. On the CBD sector, it's not such exciting news. I think novel foods has been a real killer for the sector. It's been expensive, it's been challenging, and it's really taken its toll on businesses. There will be some winners and some losers, like all situations where there's new regulatory barriers placed onto a sector. I just think the lack of clarity and guidance from the FSA on how businesses have to engage in the process, and also the restrictive nature in terms of new products and new companies, has really, really been tough. So I think many CBD companies will be considering a pivot. They may not think there's too much growth left in the sector here in the UK, but we'll see. Novel foods are supposed to provide a platform for these businesses to really enter the mainstream and grow. It's possible if we can maybe have a little bit of relaxation in the restrictions from the FSA and a more pragmatic approach, we might see more businesses doing well. There are clearly a number of CBD companies who are doing great. You look at the likes of Trip, who just seem to be doing everything at the moment and doing really, really well. Be nice to have a few more join them in that sort of steep growth cycle.
Yeah. Well, we can dig into a bit about what needs to be sorted out as well. And can I mention, within relation to industrial hemp, one of the issues has been around, not being able to use the buds. And, the analogy is always like growing apples for the wood and having to throw away the apples type thing. Yep. Are you seeing anything progressing on that? I know there's a couple of groups that are trying to lobby for change there.
The reality is no. We've been lobbying for change on that for a number of years. I remember writing a report with Voltfas, it might be as long as 3 years ago. And we engaged a licensing barrister to help us with that, Gary Grant from Francis Taylor Buildings, who's excellent. And he advised that this change that we wanted wouldn't even require primary legislation. So it's not a huge effort for the government to make that change. It could be done with a small tweak of the existing licensing regime. And it just seems to be a no-brainer, particularly post-Brexit. Why would you put British hemp farmers at a disadvantage to European counterparts? It just makes no sense. You've got a whole government department that was dedicated to identifying Brexit opportunities, and you've got this really, really small tweak that you could make to at least put British farmers on a par with EU farmers, and still they don't do it. So it's very, very frustrating. And the only sort of reasoning I can put behind it is that this government just doesn't have bandwidth to even look at these issues. Either that or they don't care. One of the two.
I think you're being far too polite when it comes to this government, but let's not get into that.
Yeah, trust me, I could do it. You should do an X-rated version of your podcast. I'd say a lot more.
The outtakes. Yeah, no, absolutely. So there's loads of stuff there. The CBD bit's really interesting, though.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it's a CPG kind of play, right? So that's a lot about brand and marketing. I guess the difficulty is always around marketing, the restrictions when it comes to CBD, and particularly because it's a product that needs some explanation. So, I think that's always been a bit of a struggle for the industry, regulations aside, in the FSA and EFSA and all of those bits. But what are you kind of seeing in that space?
Yeah, I think CBD companies have struggled to figure out how to pitch what they're selling, right? I've had companies invite me to their offices, to their manufacturing facilities, and said, Robert, we're not making any sales. Can you help us? And I'm like, well, that's not my job. First of all, I'm not a sales guy, but and I'd look at these products and they're amazing packaging, clearly very high quality, look great. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, well, what's it for? It doesn't say anything, and that's a real problem for the CBD industry. How do we explain to new consumers and new customers what it's for when there's, it's quite restrictive in terms of the medical claims that you can make? So then, rather than sort of push it towards that medical healthcare side of things, you could go the other way. You could go for a more lifestyle brand type approach, be the best you that you can be. And that seems to be successful for the beverage companies in particular. Good Rays and Trip and those guys seem to be doing fantastically well. But no one has really established themselves as a real lifestyle brand. In 2019, I was fortunate enough to be representing Ignite. Do you remember Dan Bilzerian and his CBD brand? And, I got all kinds of flack for helping them, but they were a lifestyle brand. They weren't trying to pretend that they were a medicine or, that they were going to make you well or anything like that. It was a pure lifestyle play. And whilst, we can all have our views on how they market their products, the team that I was working for, they were great and they understood what it was that they were doing, and they set out to really push that lifestyle brand. So I think that's the difficulty with CBD. Clearly people are taking it for its medical reasons, but how do you market a product where you can't actually talk about the medical benefits of it? It's a real tough one.
Really tough. And you've got a really good handle on what's going on and, the analysis behind it. If you had a magic wand, what are the key bits that you would like to change? And I guess what's the key method, right? Because we talked about this offline, lobbying or litigation or legislation, unlikely, but, how are we going to make the changes? What do you think the change should be in the first place? And then how do you think they're going to get there?
Yeah, so I've reached the conclusion that lobbying the government is not going to get us anywhere right now with this particular government. It may not get us anywhere with the next government. Labour wants to win an election. They're not going to say anything remotely progressive right now for fear of scaring off those sort of centre to right-wing voters. So my view is, if the government isn't going to assist in helping grow this industry and making it successful, then the only recourse is the courts, right? And we've seen this done successfully in many other countries in Europe and around the world. And you need test cases and you need sort of narrow issues that are clearly the legislation is wrong. For example, the one we've just spoken about, the restriction on hemp cultivation. There have also been some successful court victories in places like France and Italy on issues like CBD flower, and even on the medical cannabis side of things. As I understand it, the German medical insurance program pays for cannabis medications there because of a test case. Someone took them to court and sued them. And I just don't think we've done enough of that here in the UK. I just feel, there is clearly a will to try and take these things on, but they have to be funded properly. And that's where the issue is. Nobody really wants to be a test case. Nobody has the time, the effort, the funding, or the inclination to do it. It would be great if we could have a bit more of a collaborative approach within the sector and identify some really interesting, deserving cases that need to be heard and get them up in front of the High Court and see if we can get a judgment. Even if you lose a test case, if there is a strongly worded judgment from a High Court judge saying, unfortunately, I can't find in your favour, but clearly the law on this is wrong, then even that is a really powerful tool to then go to government and say, look, you need to make a change here. So that's very much my view. That's how you're going to affect change in this industry here in the UK. Take matters onto the court, get the judgment you want, and then push hard to get the law to be changed to support that position.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's certainly how it happened in Germany. And I understand that there's a couple of things happening in the background in the UK in potential test cases. There's also just a recently publicised case of the first man who got his prescription for flour reimbursed by the NHS, which I think is a positive sign. Hopefully some of this creates some kind of precedent that allows other people to follow on.
Yeah, I mean, look, for example, I don't think medical insurance here in the UK covers cannabis medications, and that may be because of its status as an unlicensed medication. But it would be interesting, wouldn't it, to take someone who works in a professional environment, who has medical insurance, who has a prescription, and wants their insurance to pay for it. That'd be great, to take that case on to the courts and see if we could get a judgment to say, actually, yes, medical insurance in the UK should pay for cannabis medications. That'd be an interesting case to take on, and I'm sure it would have a strong chance of being successful as well.
Yeah, fingers crossed. And yeah, let's see. Like I said, there's a couple of things that I've been hearing off the record, but not quite sure how much they've progressed yet.
Yeah.
But, I mean, you kind of mentioned bits around the political spectrum in the UK, and it doesn't look like either party, whoever's in power next, has got the balls really to take this area on in terms of as a election pledge for fear of alienation of core voters. May well change once that party is in power and maybe has a kind of mandate for 4 years, but let's see. But it's not something we should be counting on. Are you seeing much from the data side, so the research, in terms of, I mean, obviously inevitably more data and more research will help make things more persuasive, but are you seeing much around that?
Yeah, I mean, look, you have this situation now where medical cannabis is effectively split into two sections. In fact, I think it was when you had Oliver Jugel on your podcast, he explained it really, really well, that medical cannabis effectively breaks down into two sectors. You've got your pharmaceutical cannabis, which is, GW and the clinical trials and the research and that sort of thing. And then you have this current section, which is the unlicensed medication sections. And he described it as being used for modern ailments, sleep and anxiety and pain and that sort of thing. So the difficulty with research is very, very expensive. It's very expensive to do, significant research. And they're just, it's not just from a commercial perspective, but also from an R&D perspective, it is difficult to raise money in the UK at the moment. I have clients who have been granted R&D licenses from the Home Office, and they've got the green light to do these really interesting in vitro studies on isolated cannabinoids and their effect on various pain conditions, fibromyalgia and that sort of thing. And they can't raise the money to actually, build the extraction facility and initiate the trials. So it's a tough one. There clearly is the ability to obtain licenses from the Home Office to carry out this research. It's just funding it that is the issue.
Yeah, funding. And it just hasn't been a priority for a lot of companies. And, my cynical view on a lot of the people claiming to be medical cannabis companies, that they're sort of recreational in waiting because they haven't really done the type of things that a medical company would be expected to do. But that's a broader whinge from me.
Look, I agree with you on it. I don't necessarily think it's wrong. I mean, the reality is most people in this sector, that's what they want. That's the end goal, isn't it? I think we could all support an adult use market. How you get there is the real debate. Okay, so I think, in my view, in the next 3 to 4 years, it should be entirely possible to convert 200,000 to 300,000 of that 1.8 million who are self-medicating from the illicit market. We should be able to convert them into legal patients, right? There should be no reason why we shouldn't be able to have a medical cannabis market here comparable to the size of the one in Germany. Now, what happens when you then push on beyond that 300,000 number and you start to get up to 500,000 and 600,000, which I think is absolutely doable by the end of the decade? Then you can really start having a serious conversation about, okay, should we be talking about a rec market? Should we be talking about an adult use market here in the UK? So I think, the reality is that if that's what businesses are trying to achieve in the long term, then spending loads of money on research and development isn't in their interests. So I think you're absolutely right. I think your hunch is probably correct. It's just nobody wants to talk about it.
No, I mean, it's interesting. That time horizon is significantly longer than, a lot of the reports would have you think or believe, or I think, that's sort of changed certainly over the last 5 years. But again, I think you're right. We are looking at those sort of timescales, end of the decade kind of thing.
You know how these things go. It's slow, and then suddenly very quickly. I mean, nobody expected what happened in November 2018 to occur the way that it did. But you've got to have something to sort of push at the door with. And right now, if you've only got 20 or 30,000 patients in the medical cannabis industry, then, there isn't too much really to grab the attention of the government. The sector is still small. So, I think the medical cannabis sector collectively has to take matters into their own hands, really sort of push the boundaries and, market themselves, market the industry, and get those numbers up. And then when you see significant numbers in the sector, then you can start talking about further reform at a governmental level.
Yeah, I think it'll sort of make people's fear of it less, right? I think if we can see that it's...
Exactly. The destigmatization of it, as numbers increase, you'll start to see medical cannabis patients in the workplace and in social environments, and it will become far more normal and acceptable. And then you can start talking about a rec market, I think. But I don't think it's something that people should be afraid of saying that they'd like to see. We get told this in the sector all the time. Don't talk about rec, don't talk about rec, don't talk about rec. And I do understand the reasons as to why. But at the same time, with realistic timelines, I don't see why we can't have that conversation. And in fact, I'm really happy to see that an organisation like the Cannabis Industry Council has a subgroup that is actually, having these discussions about whether there could be an adult use market in the UK and how it would work.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. It should be scoped out for sure. So cool. As we sort of come towards the end, you work in Europe as well with, you've got a lot of counterparts.
Yep.
There's a few organisations of lawyers that you're part of. So you've got a really good eye on what's going on there as well. What's your view from abroad? Are there jurisdictions that you think are doing things better than others, and there's some pilot schemes that are working in different countries? And in particular, actually, I want to pick up on a point that you said earlier, something you posted previously around the rowing back of the German plans and how that could in some way benefit the UK. If you could elaborate a bit on that as well, that would be great.
So you know how it was when, we're talking about a year ago, 18 months ago, when Germany announced its intention to introduce a fully liberalised and legalised regulated cannabis market. Everybody just, lost their minds. 400 tonnes a year, 500 tonnes a year, 600, 700. It was crazy. And I spoke to people in Germany and I said, this 400 tonnes a year number, it's bullshit, right? You just made that up to try and attract investment. And they said, no, it's actually a conservative estimate. They were talking about 600 tonnes plus another 700 for the tourists. So, of course, everyone was going nuts. We've got to supply to Germany. We've got to be in Germany. Germany, Germany, Germany. That's all you heard. And from a wider point of view, that's great. If Germany did manage to achieve that, you'd expect the dominoes to fall and all of the other European countries would follow suit, and eventually the pressure would ramp up in the UK to get involved. You couldn't just sit there whilst you've got this huge industry in North America and this rapidly growing industry in Europe and not do anything. So that was the sort of positives I was taking from it. Germany would lead to sort of reform across Europe. However, the issues with the European Commission, I mean, there's a debate as to whether Germany even asked the European Commission for permission or not, but the likelihood is that the European Commission was never going to sign off on it due to, the requirements for international supply and all that kind of stuff, which the UN Convention does not permit for recreational purposes. So when Germany suddenly had to row back on their position, the focus immediately returned to the UK. All of these international cannabis companies who had planned to supply into Germany, whether it was even going to be possible or not, I don't know. But as soon as they rowed back from their position, then the growth potential in the UK market became the focus again. So from my practice perspective, that's great. From a wider perspective, it's not so great. Because the thing is, the suggestion is with Germany's reduced plans, the home grow, the cannabis social clubs in particular, yes, these are progressive steps, but do they help build an economically successful industry? The suggestion is no, because the supply to the cannabis social clubs will probably come mostly from the existing illicit cultivators and producers.
As it does in Holland.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's it, isn't it? We want these things to happen and we want to see progress and we want to see sensible policies being introduced. But at the same time, we also want a successful economically viable industry. And sometimes they don't go hand in hand. And I think that's been one of the problems in the UK. When medical cannabis was legalized, the campaign behind it was patients. We need to give patients a safe and legal route to access cannabis-based medications, right? We need to give access to patients. The government then did that. And now we're saying, actually, we need help because no one can make any money in this business. And the government is saying, well, that's not what you asked us for. You asked us to create a safe and legal route for patients. You didn't ask us to create an economically viable industry. And I think that's where, the businesses are going to have to take matters into their own hands. If they want to make it economically viable, then they're going to have to push the boundaries. They're going to have to maybe take on a little bit more risk in how they operate. And that's how you then build the industry. So yeah, the mood from my counterparts in Germany is very, very negative. I mean, when I saw them recently in Prague, they were just incredibly despondent. The suggestion seems to be that the German government has really messed things up, and it's unlikely they will go back to the European Commission and try again anytime soon, if at all. So yeah, there's good things happening in Europe, but there's also missed opportunities too, which is sad.
Yeah, and I think some of the more sobering analysis when the news came out in Germany, and when I say that, basically listening to Alfredo was
we have the same sources.
Exactly, was very cautious optimism. And yeah, I think it was in the interests of a lot of people raising money to hype it out of, proportion. And that's certainly what happened. And then the reality is set in because, governments realise that it's got its hands tied on a number of international levels and it can only do so much. And so it's not that surprising to me from having followed it, but I do appreciate there's a lot more running.
The irony of it all is that the one European country that doesn't need permission from the European Commission for anything is the UK. If the UK was so minded, and would have been nice to see Jacob Rees-Mogg and as the Minister of Brexit Opportunities to come out and say, we found one. Yeah. We're going to legalise cannabis, and the European Commission can't say anything about it. So, yeah,
I think it's more focused on tomato ketchup being 5 pence cheaper or something.
Yeah. There we go. I mean, look, it is a shame about what happens in Germany. Again, people like Alfredo can speak much better about the subject than me as to whether the government really ever even wanted it to happen. But, we move forward, and like I said, the growth potential in the UK market is massive, absolutely massive. And I just love to see everybody working hard to get those patient numbers up and get as many people as we can into the legal regime, because that's how we affect real change here.
Absolutely. And it's a great way to end it on a very positive note for the UK, hopefully. I'm really hoping to have that patient that we just mentioned with first cannabis flower NHS reimbursement on the podcast in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, good. Yeah.
That can be a positive story that will hopefully stimulate more patients, being able to get prescribed. But let's see. But thank you, Rob, for sharing your time, and great to finally get you on.
Yeah, thank you, mate. I appreciate it, and I'm delighted to actually get it done.
Yeah, brilliant. Cool. Okay, and always welcome back. So hopefully see you again soon.
All right, mate. All the best.
Cheers. Take care. Thanks again for listening. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please subscribe, rate, review, and share the podcast. It will help me spread the good word on how this amazing industry is developing. I'm a commercial lawyer and I work with a number of cannabis businesses in the UK. If you need help with commercial contracts, data protection, employment, corporate, or other business legal needs, please do get in touch with me via LinkedIn or at anuj@canvas.global.